So how does it happen? How did two allies who fought side by side end up as mortal enemies? Well, today we're going to trace that exact journey. We're talking about the 60-year saga of Athens and Sparta, from allies to rivals on the brink of a massive war. And get this, our guides for this whole thing are the OGs of history themselves, Herodotus and Thucydides. All right, let's get into it.
Okay, first things first, let's meet our two main players. And trust me, they could not be more different. On one side, you've got Sparta. Think of them as the ultimate land power. Super rigid, conservative, ruled by a select few, and honestly, pretty terrified of change. Their entire society was built on the backs of an enslaved population, the Helots, and their whole world revolved around their legendary army of hoplites. And then you've got Athens, totally different vibe. A bustling, ambitious naval powerhouse, a radical democracy that was all about innovation, expansion, and looking out to the sea. You can already see, right? These fundamental differences, they're going to set the stage for everything that follows.
So the big question is, how did it all go so wrong? I mean, how does a shared, glorious victory against the common enemy just curdle into suspicion, fear, and eventually all-out war? That's what we're going to explore, how this relationship completely fell apart. And we're going to keep coming back to a really key question. Was Sparta just trying to hang on to its top dog status as Athens got bigger and bigger? That's the story we're here to unpack. All right, let's set the stage. Our story actually kicks off, kind of ironically, with a moment of unity. We're talking about the Persian Wars. A massive empire from the east is threatening to wipe Greece off the map. It's an existential threat. And this huge danger, it forces these two polar opposite powers, Athens and Sparta, into a really tense but absolutely necessary alliance. Just to survive. Now, even though they had their differences, and Herodotus, our man on the ground, tells us those issues were already bubbling under the surface, they managed to create something called the Hellenic League. And who was the undisputed leader? The hegemon, as they'd say? Sparta, of course. Their army was just unmatched. This thing, the serpent column, made from the melted-down bronze of captured Persian weapons, is the perfect symbol of that moment. It's a monument to what they could do when they actually worked together.
But once Persia was defeated, everything changed. The common enemy was gone, and that left this huge power vacuum in the Aegean Sea. You know who was more than ready to step in and fill that void? Yep, ambitious, up-and-coming Athens.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Sparta basically just steps aside. They had the chance to lead, but they backed off. So why? Well, our other guide, Thucydides, gives us a couple of reasons. First, they were super paranoid that their own commanders would get corrupted by power if they were stationed too far from home. But the second reason is wild. At that exact moment, they actually saw Athens as a friendly, capable partner. So they just withdrew. And that left the field wide open for Athens.
And you better believe Athens seized that opportunity. They immediately created something called the Delian League. Now, on paper, its purpose sounded amazing, totally noble. It was supposed to be a defensive alliance to keep fighting Persia and liberate other Greek cities. Sounds great, right? Well, that noble purpose wasn't going to last very long.
Yeah, because almost right away, Athens started to systematically twist this league of allies into an empire of subjects. Thucydides lays it all out for us, step by step. First, they started forcing cities to join against their will. Then, if anyone tried to leave, they crushed the revolt. By 454 BC, they literally moved the league's entire treasury from the island of Delos to Athens and started using that cash for their own vanity projects, like the temples on the Acropolis. And here's the kicker. They started demanding cash payments from their allies instead of ships. What did that do? It meant Athens' navy got bigger and bigger, while its so-called allies were effectively disarmed. Genius, but ruthless. So you can feel it, right? The suspicion is building. Athens is getting more powerful and way more arrogant. Sparta is just watching. And then the incident happens. The one thing that completely shatters this fragile peace and turns all that suspicion into outright open hostility. Thucydides paints the scene for us perfectly. First, a massive, catastrophic earthquake just devastates Sparta. This triggers their absolute worst nightmare, a huge revolt by their enslaved Helot population. So the Athenian general, a guy named Cimon, who actually likes Sparta, convinces Athens to send a big army to help them out. A nice gesture, right? But when the Athenians get there, the Spartans get paranoid. They start worrying that these democratic soldiers might give their slaves some dangerous ideas. So they publicly dismiss the Athenian army and send them packing. It was a massive, public, and deeply humiliating slap in the face. And the fallout was immediate. The Athenians were furious, absolutely outraged. They officially tore up that old alliance from the Persian Wars, and then they went and made a brand new one with Sparta's #1 enemy, Argos. Just like that, the first open conflict between them was on.
So, that first round of fighting eventually ended with what they called the 30 Years' Peace in 446 BC. But let's be real, it wasn't peace. It was much more like an ancient Cold War. You had this period of super intense competition and proxy battles with the two big power blocks, Athens and its Delian League versus Sparta and its Peloponnesian League, both just jockeying for dominance. And this Cold War period was just full of flashpoints, what Thucydides calls the ATI, the immediate sparks. First, Athens makes an alliance with Corcyra, which was a rebellious colony of Corinth, Sparta's most important ally. Big deal. Then Athens goes and lays siege to Potidæa, another city with strong ties to Corinth. And then, for the finishing touch, Athens slaps a crippling economic embargo on Megara, Sparta's next-door neighbor. I mean, every single one of these moves was a direct poke in the eye to Sparta and its entire alliance.
So the pressure on Sparta is just becoming immense. And it's not just from Athens. Thucydides records this incredible, fiery speech from Sparta's allies, the Corinthians, and they're basically screaming at the Spartans, do something. They're accusing Sparta of being slow, of just sitting around while Athens is running wild all over Greece. And this is a really crucial point. Sparta wasn't just being pushed toward war by Athens' aggression, they were being pushed by their own allies to act like the leader, the hegemon, and protect them.
Okay, so we've seen all the sparks, right? The fights over Corcyra, Potidæa, Megara. But Thucydides, our master historian, he tells us don't just look at the sparks. He wants us to look deeper, to find the real, underlying reason this whole thing exploding.
And here it is. This might be the single most famous sentence in his entire work. Thucydides argues that the real cause, what he calls the prophasis, it wasn't any single argument or decree, no. It was the fundamental shift in the balance of power across the Greek world. It was, simply, the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. That's it. That's the real reason.
So, let's bring it all home and answer our main questions. First, how did the relationship develop? Well, it didn't develop, it decayed. It went from reluctant allies fighting Persia to open rivals after that humiliating snub over the Helot revolt, and finally to declared enemies, ready for war. And what about Sparta's motives? It really was a messy combination of things, wasn't it? There was the pressure to keep their top spot, that deep-seated paranoia about a slave rebellion, and in the end, a totally rational fear of being overshadowed by this new Athenian superpower. And that kind of brings us to our final, lingering thought. This whole story of Athens and Sparta, it has echoed down through the centuries. It's a pattern that modern thinkers have even given a name, the Thucydides trap. The idea that when a rising power threatens to displace an established one, is conflict pretty much inevitable? It's a heavy question, and it's just as relevant today in our world as it was 2,500 years ago.